They called Alcatraz escape-proof, an island carved from stone, water cold enough to kill, currents strong enough to swallow ships, guards watching every second. No one had ever beaten it, until 3 men vanished, without a sound. No bodies, no footprints, no sightings, only a hole in a wall, a handmade raft, and the most haunting question in American criminal history. Did they die in the water, or did they get away with the impossible? Tonight we go inside the plan that took months to build in total silence. Hidden inside prison walls, above the cell blocks, behind the vents. A plan so perfect, the FBI spent 17 years searching for answers and never found the truth. This isn't just an escape. It's the one mystery Alcatraz still refuses to give up. Night settled over Alcatraz, with a deliberate calm that felt closer to control than to peace. The bay darkened beneath a layer of fog that clung to the surface like oil, its reflection swallowing every glimmer of city light from across the water. The island looked carved out of shadow, its walls glistening with the cold sheen of salt, carried by the wind. Above the yard, the guard tower lights cut through the mist in sharp, deliberate strokes, slicing the darkness into measured beams that illuminated pieces of the compound. A railing here, a length of barbed wire there, the curve of a catwalk slick with condensation. Every few seconds the light moved, the beam sliding over the yard wall, before returning to its starting point with mechanical obedience. Inside, the building adjusted to its nightly rhythm. The long corridors took on a new voice, a blend of echo, metal, and low electrical hum. The prison didn't fall silent. It compressed sound until it became part of its heartbeat. The faint hiss of ventilation filled the gaps where conversation would have lived. Every pipe seemed to breathe on its own, expanding and settling with the temperature drop. Somewhere deep within the walls, a valve released pressure in a single metallic sigh. The place was alive, but its pulse belonged to systems, not men. The cell block stood in its precise geometry, as though the architect had drawn the lines to punish any softness. Rows aligned perfectly, every cot pressed against the same section of wall, every blanket folded to regulation. Stainless cups rested upside down on shelves, still wet at the rim. The floors held a thin gloss from the day's mopping, a film of moisture that caught the faint light and made it look as though the concrete itself were sweating. Even the air carried weight, a mix of iron, soap, and the sour residue of steam. It wasn't unpleasant, just exacting. A guard's steps broke the stillness. Heel, toe, pause. The rhythm echoed through the corridor, steady as a metronome. He carried his flashlight low, the beam sweeping over bars and nameplates. Behind those bars, movement barely registered. The slow turn of a head, the lift of a hand, the press of fabric against skin. The men didn't watch him, but they listened. They always listened. The sound of boots on steel told them everything they needed to know: distance, timing, authority. Even in sleep, their bodies tracked the route of the watch. The sound was order. Order was safety. Faces showed themselves only in fragments. A cheek catching light, a brow glinting under sweat, a hand curling around a rail. The night stripped them of distinction. Without daylight, they became patterns within the machinery, silhouettes moving, in small allotted gestures. The guards didn't think of them as individuals now. At this hour they were figures in a ledger, accounted for by count and location. When the voice called through the grill, count, numbers replaced names with ease. Locks turned, hinges groaned, and the corridor answered with the same series of sounds it had produced for decades. This was what kept the island from unraveling. Repetition, precision, the comfort of the known. Outside, the water struck the island's edge in a steady pulse. Each wave met concrete with a low, blunt sound that carried through the foundation and up into the pipes. The vibration trembled faintly through the floor, merging with the building's other noises. The drone of vents, the scrape of a metal latch, the faint hum of lights that never slept. Somewhere below, a pump sputtered to life and forced water through corroded pipes, its rhythm uneven but familiar. The guards heard it without noticing, the way one hears their own breathing. For the inmates, the sound was proof of life beyond the cells. For the island, it was just the sound of itself thinking. Every object told a story: a bolt streaked with rust, a small thread torn from a blanket, a bead of moisture forming on a pipe that hadn't cooled since afternoon. The details mattered, not for their beauty, but for their persistence. They marked time better than any clock. The guards noticed them in passing, the way a soldier notes his weapon's balance. The prisoners noticed them differently, with a kind of devotion born from too many hours of observation. They could tell which pipe ticked before the lights flickered, which hinge whispered before the guard turned the corner. They lived by fragments, piecing the island's mechanics into a language of survival. On the upper tiers, a guard leaned against the railing and took a sip from a dented thermos. The coffee had cooled, but it didn't matter. The ritual was what counted. The heat against his hand, the smell that broke the metallic air. Below him, the tiers stretched into dimness. Every cell identical, until the light reached the far wall. Radios sat on belts, mute but heavy, their weight a quiet promise. The beam at the end of the corridor flickered through the lattice, breaking into thin ribbons that fell onto the floor like wire. Guards stepped through the light without hesitation, the same way every night. Habit replaced awareness. One of them thumbed the ring of keys hanging from his belt until one edge bit into his skin. The sting brought him back to the moment. Pain was useful that way. It confirmed he was still present. He listened again. The faint rattle of air through vents, the creak of a distant bunk, the mechanical sigh of the generator's cycling power. Everything was where it should be. Above, the catwalk trembled as another guard crossed it. The vibration rippled through the ceiling, setting loose a brief rain of dust. From up there, the layout of the cells resembled a blueprint, perfect rectangles, stacked in discipline. The symmetry shrank the men inside them, reducing individuality to placement. Sound distorted in the structure. Nothing reached pure. Laughter, when it occurred, broke apart halfway through, leaving only the beginning and the end. The middle never survived. Even joy obeyed the architecture. Far across the water, a foghorn moaned 3 slow notes. The sound arrived softened, its edges blurred by distance and vapor. Alcatraz absorbed it without acknowledgement. The island didn't return sound. It processed it, filed it, let it dissolve into the hum of its own mechanics. On the desk of a guard station, a clipboard waited, with lined columns and shorthand notations. Check marks, initials, numbers. Every mark stood for a presence verified. A door secured, a light confirmed functional. It wasn't emotion that held the island steady. It was record-keeping. Each stroke of pencil reaffirmed the order that kept chaos at bay. Time moved differently here. The clock on the wall ticked at its regular pace, but the air between ticks felt long. Guards moved through corridors, as though walking underwater. The minute hand announced progress to anyone who cared to look. The second hand, almost invisible, handled the real work in silence. That division defined the place, the visible order versus the unseen tension beneath it. The prisoners understood it. So did the guards. The night had its own version of faith. Do your part, stay exact. Let the structure believe for you. Narrowed until it felt private. Dust hung unmoving. A moth beat once against the wall and vanished into shadow. In the corner, an old web stretched between pipes, its strands dry but intact. It had been there longer than most of the men. The guards passed without noticing, their focus locked forward. Their work was to maintain the pattern, not admire it. By the final hours, the building's breathing had slowed. The guard rotations thinned. Conversation disappeared entirely. The air seemed to stand still, as though the island itself was waiting for verification. Every door was closed. Every lock counted. The corridors existed in perfect symmetry. No noise, no drift, only the hum of fluorescent light. Alcatraz stood like a ledger balanced to the decimal. The night had done its work. The routines held. The men stayed contained. The officers unbroken by fatigue. From outside, the island looked still, but inside every part moved in quiet coordination. Steel, stone, and human muscle working as one system. Cold began to creep through the walls in the early hours. It wasn't the chill of weather, but the settling of the building itself, as though concrete remembered the absence of the sun. The island exhaled heat from its bones. A faint, rhythmic release. The guards, half-trained by years of the same duty, adjusted their stance without thinking. A cough sounded where none should. A latch shuddered slightly, and a flashlight beam swept to confirm it. Nothing out of place. The equilibrium returned. Down below, the utility tunnels ran like arteries through the stone. Warm air moved sluggishly through them, picking up moisture and dust. The sound of dripping water echoed without origin, bouncing off the curved walls. Somewhere, a pressure valve clicked shut. The vibration climbed back through the structure, faint but traceable, joining the night's quiet rhythm. Outside, the tide turned. The current around the island shifted direction, with the slow inevitability of a clock, hand reaching its mark. If anyone had listened closely enough, pressed an ear to the floor, perhaps, they might have heard the subtle change in the water's voice. A deeper register signaling that morning was closer than it seemed. But the men above didn't listen for the sea. Their world ended at the walls, their hearing tuned to hinges, locks, and boots. At the edge of the corridor, where the final bulb's light dissolved into darkness, the space, when dawn finally began its slow approach across the bay, light touched the island in fragments. It found the tower first, then the yard, then the roof vents steaming in the cold. Inside, no one celebrated the return of day. The guards finished their checks, the prisoners stirred in their bunks, and the machinery of order prepared to repeat itself. The night had not been conquered. It had simply been measured, contained, and signed off. For now, the arithmetic balanced. The island held. It didn't start with a plan. It started with a sound, barely more than a tremor against concrete. A vibration shy as breath. At first it blended with the usual choir of Alcatraz nights, pipes ticking, Distant doors, sighing shut, metal expanding under the heat of steam, but this sound was wrong. It came in pulses. It came in rhythm. It repeated. It was the sound of defiance learning how to whisper. Inside one of the narrow gray cells, so ordinary it could be anyone's, routine had begun to deform, not by force, not by rage, but by patience. A sliver of metal, broken from something long forgotten, moved back and forth between fingers in the dark. Its edge was dull. Its purpose was clear. It pressed into plaster at the base of an air vent, scoring the wall with a persistence too precise to be boredom. Every scrape was timed. Only when guards walked, when boots masked the noise, when the island exhaled just loud enough to cover the work. It was surgery, not sabotage. A slow, methodical removal of barriers, disguised as stillness. Concrete is supposed to be permanent, but permanence means nothing against repetition. The wall didn't crack. It loosened. Flecks of plaster collected behind the sink, in the seam between bunk and floor, under the heel of a shoe waiting to crush them into anonymity. The man doing it never rushed. He scraped 3 times. Then waited. Then 3 more. In a place where seconds are endless, patience becomes a weapon. The vent cover itself was iron, bolted in with blunt arrogance. It wasn't the first thing to be attacked. It was the last. The real work happened around it. Tiny holes drilled in a pattern that looked like nothing until you stepped back and saw the perimeter of freedom. The tool changed. The sliver of metal was too slow, too weak, too hopeful. Something stronger was needed. Somewhere in the prison's junk. Mops, buckets, brooms with broken handles. There had been an old vacuum cleaner. Its motor was dead, at least in its original life. But dead things can be resurrected. In the workshop where broken things went to be forgotten. A pair of hands tested wires, coaxed sparks, listened for the tremor of movement. When the motor finally spun, even at half power, the sound was like permission. Attached to a bit fashioned from scavenged metal, the motor became a drill. Not a drill as the world knows them. Not neat, not fast, not controllable. It stuttered, it bucked, it howled like a small animal. But in the right hands it could chew through the miserable material behind the vent. Plaster, concrete, rust-softened metal. It could make possibilities exist where none were meant to. Night after night, the motor hummed like a dying cicada. Short bursts, then silence. Work paused when footsteps approached. The tool hid in laundry, under mattresses, inside hollowed books, whose pages had been replaced by cloth. The ingenuity wasn't in the drilling. It was in the invisibility. Each air vent was the same size. Each cell, the same dimensions. But the walls, those walls had personalities. Some were thick with generations of paint. Some held moisture that softened plaster into powder. Some hid pipes like bones close to skin. The men learned their walls like other men learn maps. And when maps are understood, routes appear. The holes came first in clusters of 2 or 3, spaced like cautious footsteps, then in lines, then in arcs. Eventually they formed a rough outline of the vent frame. The more holes, the more the wall softened. The more the vent loosened in its seat. The vent wasn't being removed. It was being persuaded. By day, nothing was out of place. A suitcase leaned just high enough to hide the damage. A piece of cardboard, cut with surgical precision, slid into the gap like it had always been there. Guards don't look at cardboard. Guards look for movement. The brilliance of the work was that nothing moved. Until it had to. Dust was the true enemy. Plaster leaves trails. Concrete leaves scent. Every grain had to disappear. It was gathered with wet paper towels, with damp socks tied to broom handles. It was smeared into corners where grime already lived. It was swallowed by blankets. It was washed down drains one handful at a time. The island might be concrete, but even concrete can be tricked. Momentum grew. Holes connected. The vent frame sagged slightly when nudged. Behind it, darkness, a gap, air, the taste of something larger than a cell. One night the vent came free with a sound so small, it didn't even qualify as a click. It was the sound of history taking a breath. A hand slid into the opening first, then a wrist, then a shoulder turned sideways, to fit. The body that followed was cautious, testing every inch. The wall scraped skin. The air smelled old, dust, metal, the stale sweat of decades of heat, trapped between stone and pipe. It wasn't freedom, but it was space, and space was more than they had been allowed in years. The corridor behind the walls was narrow, only wide enough to crawl. Pipes ran overhead like ribs. The floor was rough, covered in grit, but it was unguarded, unwatched, unseen. A place the prison had forgotten. He froze every few seconds, listening. No footsteps, no chains, only the hum of boilers, and the distant thud of the bay against the shore. The silence felt wrong, like stepping into a room that should be full. He smiled in the dark, not with his mouth, with his breath. Back in the cell, the vent was put back into place. The cardboard returned. The suitcase leaned. The blanket folded. Order resumed. But something had changed. The cell was no longer a cell. It was an entrance. And once an entrance exists, paths begin to form. Not by accident, not by luck, but by design. Soon, other cells followed, other vents loosened, other holes connected. The prison walls, proud, unbreakable, had hairline fractures now. They didn't show in daylight. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't need to. Because the most dangerous thing in Alcatraz wasn't rage or violence. It was silence with intention. Silence that scraped concrete. Silence that hid behind cardboard. Silence that counted the guard's footsteps, like a metronome. Every act of patience was a blade. Every grain of plaster removed was a promise. Every measured breath was a step. The prison still believed in its perfection. It didn't know it was already bleeding. The wall did not open into freedom. It opened into anatomy. A narrow void ran behind the cells like a second spine. A service corridor built for maintenance, and then largely abandoned to dust and heat. The air there tasted metallic, dense with the breath of copper and iron. It held a warmth that did not belong to the night. The warmth of boilers and steam lines humming their stubborn lullaby. Pipes crossed overhead in a tight geometry, each joint wrapped in old tape that had gone the color of nicotine. Each valve tagged with stamps that remembered administrations no one spoke of anymore. The floor was not a floor so much as a shallow trough of grit, cigarette husks, and the fine, powdery history of 1,000 hammer strikes someplace else in the building. It pressed into palms. It climbed cuffs. It got in the teeth. Bodies learned it by inches. A shoulder turned to become a blade. A forearm pinned to rib to narrow the silhouette that space demanded. Hands moved not by reaching, but by listening, feeling rivet heads as landmarks, memorizing the slick seam of a particular weld, the cooling heartbeat of a hot water line. The corridor taught a different attention than the tier. Here, sound did not travel in straight lines. It leaked through hairline seams, and returned altered by metal. A hissing whisper here, a dampened thrum there. The whole place speaking in a language of pressure more than volume. Boots on the catwalk 40 feet and a wall away became a soft, regular pulse that could be mistaken for the building's own blood if you didn't believe in men. Light was rationed like contraband. Where a vent in a cell breathed, a faint veil of fluorescence drifted in and made a bruise-colored rectangle on the opposite surface. Elsewhere there was only what a stolen flashlight, shaded by a hand, would allow, a narrow blade, the width of a finger that cut across dust, and showed a sparkling of plaster grains like stars caught in a jar. The beam never lingered. Eyes learned to read shadow. The trick was not to see everything. The trick was to see enough. There were rules here, and none were written. Never drag a shoe, dragging whispers along metal. Never let cloth brush a pipe with condensation. Moisture leaves signatures. Count the breaths between each motion. Motion is noise. Pause when the building speaks suddenly. Pumps begin. Vents close. Valves shift with small metallic vowels. Those are the moment's guards. Pause too, and two pauses can become a conversation if you're not careful. They advanced on their knees and elbows, a slow quadrant at a time, marking each terminus of a panel line with a tiny scrape no one else would notice. The corridor turned and narrowed, then widened enough to allow someone to roll a shoulder and relax a spine, for the space of one breath. A section of insulation sagged from its rope, like tired skin. The heat from a broad copper main rose and washed the face with a damp, feverish warmth that carried the ghost smell of soap, starch, and kitchens. Somewhere above and several walls away, a tray clattered, and the sound came down as a distant clink, the afterthought of metal. They stopped, counted to 12, never 10, never 15, 12 because it felt like stealing from two clocks at once, then went on. The first time a palm found the vertical ladder up, it did not feel like victory. It felt like risk measured in rungs. The ladder had been painted the same prison green as everything else that needed to pretend it belonged. And the paint had gathered a decade of dust, so when a hand closed around it the residue came away, in gray stripes across the lifelines. Above the shaft climbed not to sky, but to a hatch that looked like a decision in sheet metal. A ventilator cover pinned by a bolt, meant to be unromantic. The air at the mouth of the shaft moved differently. It pulled softly, a low draft like the breath of a sleeping animal. Coolness gathered there in a curl, and then dissolved again. The way currents eddy around a rock in a river. They descended without testing the hatch the first night. That was the rule. Never test a thing the first time you find it. Learning and touching cannot be the same motion. They mapped instead. Two bodies in the corridor. Our negotiation. 3 become choreography. 4 require a conductor. Silence did the conducting. A closed fist held at shoulder height meant stop. 2 fingers spread and lowered meant reverse. A palm flattened and pressed twice to iron meant listen. They moved by signs made for sightlines that were sometimes only a hand's length across. In that closeness, identity dissolved into function. Not names, not reputations, only which hand held the light, which shoulder bore the roughest abrasion, which knee could take the pressure of a long hold without twitching. The workshop was not yet a place. It was an intention in a corner, at the top of a crossbeam, where dust had settled so thick it could be coaxed into staying. A small board was set as if by accident, then another. A toolbox would have been too loud an admission. Instead, scraps migrated one by one through the corridor and up the ladder. A length of plank so scuffed it could have fallen from any pallet. Glass no larger than a thumbnail wrapped in cloth, to keep it from talking. A coil of thin wire disguised inside the hem of a shirt and then undressed in the dark. Each object learned to be quiet, before it learned to be useful. The corridor had a sound that did not come from infrastructure at all. It came from bodies trying not to be. Breath pushed through teeth, when a pipe insisted on burning a forearm. Cloth rasped once, apologized in a held stillness, then made no further comment. A knee slid, and found a screw head, and the pain climbed the leg like clean fire. The hand that owned the knee tightened on itself and bled crescent moons into the palm, rather than ask the mouth to make sound. This was the tuition the corridor demanded, and the men paid it in small, steady coins. They learned the patrol's metronome, without counting it. 10 minutes between passes on an average circuit. 7 on a vigilant one. 13. When a chat formed at the near end of the tier, and lazy confidence offered an unintended gift. But the corridor insisted on a second layer of time. The boil and ebb of steam. The way the main line exhaled in 37-second cycles. The interval between two distant ruptures of wind against louvers. A rhythm not human, but machine, which is to say dependable once you submit to its math. To be safe here, you had to lie inside both clocks at once, the guards in the buildings, and find the seam where their ticks fell out of phase. When the periscope was born, it was not as a device but as a problem set. How to look without being seen in a place designed, so that anything looking from the wrong angle must be seen. A shard of mirror, 2 slips of sheet metal bent like eyelids, a length of wood sanded to an austerity that would not splinter in the hand. The thing came together with the modesty of an object that knows the world is not improved by its existence, but might be altered. Angle was everything. Too steep, and you got a ceiling no one needed. Too shallow, and you got your own hand, reflected back with the insult of failure. When it finally returned the passing heel of a boot, inverted and thin but true, they held the breath a second longer than they had to, and then went on as if a door had not just been built inside a corner. The corridor was a secret, but secrets are heavy and heavy things sink unless you teach them buoyancy. Buoyancy here meant ritual. On entrance, wipe the cuffs. On exit, comb the hair with wet fingers to catch the dust, as if grooming rather than hiding. Place the vent grill with the screw points at the exact angle they were found. Men who live by inspection remember angles, as well as absences. Slide the cardboard until it kisses the paint ridge you measured with a thumbnail 2 nights earlier. Lean the suitcase, so its weight sings the same soft note against the cot frame. Ritual is not romance. Ritual is insurance. Up here the prison sounded different. The voices of guards below were muted, softened by distance and steel. Their footsteps became nothing more than distant taps, thin and weightless. The clanging of cell doors, normally a sharp metallic bite, arrived as faint echoes, like ghosts remembering old rhythms. And beneath it all, faint but constant, there was a vibration in the beams, the cell blocks breathing in sync with the ocean. A low, steady resonance, like the pulse of the island itself. This was not escape. This was preparation. It began with a plank, just one, old weathered wood, pulled up from a forgotten maintenance area. It was laid across 2 beams to make a makeshift bench. Then another plank. Then a scrap of canvas for silence. Softening every tool laid upon it. Slowly, piece by piece, a workspace emerged. Not built in a day. Not even in a week. But over long, careful nights when the corridor's clock said the world wasn't watching. This place became sacred. They didn't speak here. They didn't need to. Hands communicated better than words. A nod was a paragraph. A breath was a warning. The body learned a new alphabet. One written in muscle tension and the angle of shoulders. The first sound the workshop ever made was not drilling. It was stitching. Raincoats, issued by the prison to keep men dry during yard work, disappeared one at a time. Never enough to raise alarm. Some were stolen. Some were traded. Some were collected from trash, where others tossed them aside, cracked or worn. More than 50 in total, stacked in uneven piles, smelling of mildew and brine. Raincoats were not fabric. They were rubber, and rubber floats. The men sliced the material with sharpened spoons, with stolen shears, with glass blades snapped from mirror fragments. Seams were cut wide, and then overlapped, stitched with thread pulled from blankets and sheets, reinforced with strips of cloth. Each piece was pressed flat, beneath a heavy plank weighted by concrete blocks. It wasn't enough to hold. It had to be airtight. That's where the steam pipes came in. A seam is just an agreement, but a vulcanized seam is a vow. They wrapped the rubber around the exposed copper pipes that carried boiling water through the prison. The heat softened the material. Pressure from the plank above forced the layers to fuse. It took minutes, then hours, then days. They worked in shifts, rotating pieces through like parts of an assembly line, until every seam shined with a dull, ghostly gloss, the look of transformation. The raft began to grow. Not on the floor. There was no floor. It grew across beams, draped like skin, stitched panel by panel, into something that defied the space that birthed it. 6 feet, 10, 12, 14. Large enough not to sneak through any corridor, large enough to carry men across Deathwater, large enough to be ridiculous. Ridiculous things are the most dangerous, because no one expects them to work. While one man stitched, another carved, wooden paddles, cut from scavenged planks, were shaped by hand. The wood was rough, resistant, old. It split easily, it dulled tools fast, so they worked slowly, shaving the surface with glass, smoothing edges with sandpaper, stolen from a maintenance locker. They rounded the grip, widened the blade. Brass bolts, pilfered from prison supply rooms, were inserted to reinforce the joints. The hardware was identical to the kind used in official equipment. If someone found a paddle, it wouldn't look handmade. It would look issued. Meanwhile, in the cell below, a musical instrument vanished. A concertina, small, accordion-like, harmless, forgettable, until its bellows were repurposed to bring air into the raft. Ingenious doesn't feel clever when you're desperate. It feels necessary. When they tested the inflation device in the workshop, the sound was low, rhythmic, almost like breathing. Each squeeze expanded the raft slightly more. The rubber accepted the air greedily. It remembered its purpose. It became alive. Tools multiplied as the space transformed into a factory of silence. A screwdriver sharpened into a chisel. A paint scraper turned into a spade. A metal rod became a pry bar. Nothing looked like what it was. Everything served a hidden purpose. And always one man watched. He lay flat on a beam near the vent opening that overlooked the tier. In his hands, a periscope made of sheet metal and a shard of mirror. He angled it down between the bars of the ceiling, watching guard patterns. Below, he could see the reflection of boots, the swing of keys, the tilt of a flashlight as it traced the cells. Every movement below had a rhythm. Walking, checking, pausing, turning. The prison believed in symmetry. The men believed in breaking it. Above it all, the workshop listened, like an animal, alert and low to the ground. On some nights, the heat was too much. Their shirts stuck to their spines, sweat dripped onto beams and vanished. The air tasted bitter, but they stayed. You don't abandon a heart just because it beats too hard. One mistake would end everything. One clatter of wood, one dropped tool, one flashlight angled just a degree higher than usual. Failure wasn't dramatic here. Failure was quiet. Failure was a thud on the floor below, and the sound of boots scrambling up the ladder. Failure was the workshop being seen. They worked with the discipline of surgeons, the reverence of priests, the fear of soldiers, and somewhere between sweat and silence, the workshop stopped being hidden. It became invisible, not because it could not be found, because it did not exist in the eyes of the prison. That was the greatest trick they ever pulled, not escaping the island, but convincing Alcatraz itself to look away, while they built the means to leave. Night after night, the raft grew. The boat no one believed could exist. The boat made of rain. The boat built in the ceiling, above despair. They stitched. They carved. They sealed. They waited. And Alcatraz, fortress, legend, executioner, slept beneath them, unaware that the first true breach of its soul was not the cutting of a wall or the lifting of a vent. It was this: men working in the dark, above the law, above the guards, above the cells, above the world they were never meant to rise past. They began with a mold, because faces, even counterfeit ones, require order before they invite belief. A rag was wrapped around a soap bar to bulk the base, wet newspaper pressed into it, until the shape became skull-like in the way a memory is. Approximate, persuasive from a distance. Plaster, mixed in a tin can that once knew beans and now knew chemistry, was poured and worked with a spoon until it set to the color of bone under winter light. The first version dried too smooth, too clean, the kind of surface that announces itself as an object. So they learned to score texture into the skin while it cured, to leave imperfections where a cheek might carry old acne, to press the dull arc of a fingernail along a brow so light would snag there and call it human. When the plaster cooled, it exhaled a faint mineral breath that settled into cloth and hair. They waited, because haste makes shine, and shine makes suspicion. And under fluorescence, suspicion is the loudest thing in a room. Paint was not paint in any honest sense. It was pigment mixed from contraband and invention. Shaved pencil lead for value, rust dust for warmth, a smear of tea for the tired yellow that lives at the edge of sickly. Gray floated under a thin veil of pinkish brown, the palette not of portraiture, but of fluorescent fatigue. The aim was never likeness. It was recognition of a different kind. The kind that satisfies a glance on patrol and returns the gaze to its route. The hair came from brushes, from clippers, from drains that collected men in a sediment no one wanted to name. Strands were trimmed short, and pressed into the plaster while it remained tacky, fixed in a mess that matched the way sleep flattens whatever pride daylight arranges. The crown learned the cowlick each bed imposes. Temples darkened, where grease finds purchase. A scalp line irregular enough to defeat the eye's appetite for pattern. On the lips, The faintest gray, because under prison lights, red is a confession, and these heads could not afford to speak. Eyes were not opened. Never that. Eyes are promises a lie cannot keep. Instead, they painted the lids with a loss of color that feels true on men who sleep badly. A touch of shadow, cooled at the inner corner where lashes make small fans of fatigue. The lashes themselves were suggested with a brush as thin as a whisper. Never too many, never even, a slight disorder that passed for nature. The nose took the longest to learn, because noses are where silhouettes break. They made them a fraction proud, a fraction crooked, thickened at the bridge with the memory of a fracture or two. Not to mimic anyone, but to create a geography. A guard's thumb would accept if it ever pressed that far. Cheeks were given a chalky flatness that prison air loves. The jawlines were softened, more by sandpaper than by sentiment, until the head could nestle into the shallow scoop a regulation pillow gives a body at rest. They laid the heads on blankets not as props but as inhabitants. Cotton stretched and creased, the weave catching at plaster's granules, so weight could pretend itself. They tucked the sheet under the neck the way routine does. Not fussy, not careless. A tug that left a shallow wall against the shoulder line. A few hairs shed onto the pillowcase, because hair sheds and omissions betray. Against the wall, the head angled just off center, the position of a man who fell asleep mid-thought. The blanket rode up to the middle of a cheek, as if pulled in a twitch, and then abandoned. They learned the mathematics of that half-inch too high, and a mouth disappears into farce. Too low and plaster gleams, where skin should absorb light. In the dark between counts, they rehearsed the simple choreography of breath, lifting the blanket once, twice, so the stall in fabric would remember motion, and hold a shape that read as rise and fall even when utterly still. The cell took its stage directions, with a modesty that kept secrets. A cup stood on its side at the edge of the shelf, with a ring of moisture drying toward Matt. A timetable of moments left behind. The shoes, heels aligned, pointed toward a life obedient to inspection. A book lay open to a middle no one had reached, its spine offering that gentle slope fresh paper refuses. They arranged absence, as if it were presence, a composition that asked to be glanced at rather than studied. To the corridor, the sound of a guard arriving traveled in vibrations. First, the metal of the tier, giving back a faint thread of footsteps long before they became fact. Keys, brass teeth polite in their chiming, touched each other and reminded the air what authority sounds like when it isn't busy. The beam of a flashlight moved in a measured corridor of white, never rising above the grill, skimming bedding, pausing to confirm shape and shadow and the hum of compliance. The heads learned to receive light without producing reflection, a trick achieved with dust and the thinnest veil of sweat rubbed from a living palm. Count, when it came, did not announce itself with drama. A flat voice named the ritual, and the ritual obeyed. The light slipped across one bed, then the next, the wrist that held it rotating with muscle memory, that had more to do with the ledger than the men. The illusion succeeded not because it was flawless, but because it was pedestrian. The heads neither asked for attention, nor rewarded it. They absorbed the glance, and gave back the reassurance a system craves at 2 in the morning, when the world narrows to columns and ticks. The guard's shadow leaned in, retreated, moved on. A second set of steps arrived slightly behind the first, a partner's orbit, and repeated the same economy. Where suspicion might have flowered, the engineering of habit cut the stem. Nothing in the frame requested a new thought. Below the tier, the island pressed its old breath against the cell house, fog rearranging itself along windows in leprous blooms that the light could not persuade into clarity. Plaster dust. That stubborn betrayer had no role left to play. It had been trapped in damp cloth and smeared along pipe and grout, until it looked like it had always lived there. The vent grills, reset in their beds, carried the small scrapes that prove nothing because everything here is scraped. The cardboard leaned where cardboard is allowed to lean. A suitcase sat where a suitcase might belong, because men keep small lives in small boxes, and prison does not erase the urge to place. If the heads twitched at all, it was because someone a floor away turned over, and the building remembered the motion and shared it through metal. The room at the top of the block, the workshop no one admitted existed, held its breath while the count walked past. The raft lay folded into a geometry that made it look less than it was, rubber creasing like a sleeping creature taught not to dream. The paddles lay stacked, their edges sanded to the color of old bread, their bolts gone dark under a whisper of grime. The periscope watched the beam of light travel and tilt, and vanish, the mirror returning a report as pale as milk. If it had a pulse, it kept it small. The copper pipes clicked as hot water surrendered to a cooler hour, each click a coin falling into a jar, and being counted. Nothing climbed, nothing fell. The night maintained its ledger. The most delicate moment came after the voices receded, and the last footfall became Steele's private memory. Silence returns too quickly when men hold it. The trick is to let it come back the way a tide does, incrementally, with overlaps and little ruins of sound left behind. They waited through that soft return, until the building owned the quiet again. The heads held their line, their pillows drinking fluorescence until it thinned and settled. The mouth of one had a nick, a tiny crescent, chipped at the edge by an unkind thumb in an earlier test. And it read as dried split skin, the kind you do not notice until morning. The other head wore a half shadow under the cheek, from a blanket fold raised with a hidden finger. It was an indulgence that stayed within reason. Between them lay a distance, the width of regulation, enough to prove separate lives, not enough to invite conversation. Elsewhere on the tier, a man coughed in his sleep, and the sound arrived broken, as if someone had erased its middle, with a clean stroke. In the cage of those edits, the heads continued their work, to be looked at and not seen. The ceiling wavered to the faint throb of ventilation. The paint collected that wavering, and made a dim river of it, sliding along block edges, in ripples that gave the illusion of breath to anything willing to borrow it. A moth hammered once against the bars, and then settled into physics. In the office beyond, a pencil traveled down a column, and stopped, the line ending where a shift would eventually end too. The page closed, the rubber band kissed its own tail, the drawer slid into its sheath, with the modest pride of well-oiled wood. The night's arithmetic, satisfied, put its glasses aside. This is what deception looks like, when it intends to live long enough to matter. It refuses spectacle. It folds itself into the geometry already trusted, and learns the exact shade of fatigue a flashlight wants to see. It trades charisma for compliance. It convinces a room to be its accomplice, the pillow to cradle, the blanket to conceal, the sheet to lie with elegant indifference. The heads were not triumphs. They were instruments tuned to the frequency of neglect, calibrated to pass inside a ritual that no longer expected surprise. When morning finally came to test what darkness had agreed to, the plaster met day's scrutiny, with a patience that belonged to stone. Not a blink to betray it, not a breath to contradict it, just the stillness of an object pretending sleep so well, that even the light, which sees everything eventually, drifted on, without demanding proof. The bolt had been soap, carved to behave like metal. Thread etched with a patience that made craft feel like prayer. Edges smoothed to meet the logic of a wrench, sheen dulled with grime, so the eye would forgive the lie. Under a palm, it held with the stubbornness of a real fastener, which is to say it pretended to resist before agreeing to purpose. When the moment came, the real hardware let go with a sigh, felt more than heard, and the ventilator cover lifted a fraction, just enough to let a new temperature kiss the knuckles. Night seeped in. It didn't arrive like a breeze. It arrived like a presence, cool and salt-heavy. The breath of something immeasurable, pressing through a wound in the ceiling. Hands steadied, shoulders locked against the frame, and the cover rose, tilted, and was caught on its hinge, with the gentleness reserved for lifting a sleeping child. No light spilled in, only a moving darkness with edges, a draft that smelled like rust and distance, and the faint, medicinal sweetness of fog. The shaft was a throat lined in chill metal, barely wider than promise, ascending into a square the size of a verdict. The body that folded into it shed its bulk the way a story sheds adjectives. Arm first, then shoulder, ribs compressing until they felt like coins stacked tight. Knees climbed to where feet had been, and took their place with a quiet scrape that sounded like a letter being opened. The air tasted different with each breath, the copper's clean bite thinning into brine, a gradient from prison to world measured in inches. A hand went forward, and found seam, rivet head, seam again, the braille of manufacture. Somewhere below, the building continued its catechism, ventilation humming, pipes clicking, a patrol's footfall landing at the practiced intervals of duty. Yet all of it felt suddenly like sound remembered from another life. Upward, the draft gathered confidence, and the metal cooled under the palm, to a degree that suggested sky. At the mouth of the shaft, the roof waited, as a weightless rumor. One hand reached into emptiness, and touched tar. A rough granular skin, warmer than expected where the day's heat had lingered, colder where fog had laid a cloth and kept it. The head followed into air that had no ceiling for the first time in years. Night sprawled there, heavy and precise, the bay laying out its black conversation below. Fog shredded itself on light, and reassembled in veils, crossing the flood lamps that swung slow arcs, and wrote pale bones across the cell house, like diagrams of anatomy. The city across the water was a low constellation, stern and indifferent, its bridges thin silver sutures on the dark. No faces, only forms. A figure rose from the shaft with the careful geometry of a tool being withdrawn from a tight space, and flattened himself to the roof, palms finding gravel, cheek tasting tar, breath opening to accept salt and cold without letting either control its pace. For a long time the motion was listening. Wind made a narrow ribbon sound, as it navigated the angles of the guard towers and the railings, a tone that shifted when a body interrupted it, and returned when the body stayed still long enough to become part of the roof's mathematics. The tower sentry's routine revealed itself in the small choreography of light, A beam that skimmed the yard to the northeast, paused, tilted, then drifted back with the laziness that comes from repetition unthreatened by novelty. The spotlight never climbed high. It had been taught that danger lives at ground level. Above the cell house, danger wore flatness as camouflage, moving only in the slow economies allowed by distance. When they slid the ventilator cover back into its resting angle, the soap bolt caught perfectly. The illusion reasserted with a whisper that convinced even the hand that made it. The hole disappeared into the catalog of roof fixtures, indistinguishable from its honest brothers, like a counterfeit bill that breathes easy because it knows the cashier won't check. They became roof-colored, learning the map by touch where sight could not be trusted. Tar seams ran like low ridges beneath the fingertips, a relief map read in braille, leading them toward the smokestack that rose like a blunt obelisk at the rear of the cell house. The stack breathed a warm breath into the cold, turning the air into a faint, sweet stink of baked bread and ash that made your mouth remember mornings from a lifetime ago. Its shadow was a vertical stain, wide enough to hide a man. If he became shadow too, they pressed there, bodies thinned to silhouettes, listening for the notes that preceded catastrophe, the quickened heel, the cough that always came before a flashlight lifted, the radio's clipped syllable that meant two bodies would choose the same line of sight. None arrived. Wind carried only its own repetitions. When they moved again, it was in a slide that asked less of the roof than walking does. A float done low, elbows and hips, arguing with gravel in a language of grit and fabric. The edge of the roof did not present itself as a border. It arrived as an absence, the precise moment the tar's grain disappeared, and the air kept going. Below, the yard resolved into geometry. Fence lines, a path scuffed pale by boot leather, a patch of ground lighter where years of foot traffic had worried it thin. Beyond the fence was the skeleton of the island, rock rising out of black water, angles held together by the idea of fortification. The northeast shore was there, not close and not far, but exactly at the distance where choice lives. Between roof and shore, the descent route stood like a problem with two lawful answers. The smokestack's iron rungs, slick with cold, set into the brick with the grim mathematics of maintenance, or the ad hoc rope, a line made of strips of cloth, braided and knotted until strength felt like belief. The rungs would ring if a boot missed. The rope would burn if a hand forgot itself. They tested weight. Iron spoke in a small, cold vowel. Cloth made no sound. The rope won, not because it was safer, but because silence is a currency that buys time. Going over the side, ask for reverence. Gravity makes a liturgy of every descent. Hands must confess, feet must convert, breath must learn a new doctrine. One by one, they let the roof become past, and the wall become present. Bodies trading planes like cards, faces pressed to stone that had kept its secrets for longer than memory. The rope carried their weight, and said nothing. Its knots landing in palms like beads on a rosary, countable and reassuring. Each a promise that there would be another. The wind altered its speech here, shearing along the wall, and stealing warmth from cheek and ear with a pickpocket's grace. Somewhere to the west, a buckblee sent a single note, again and again, a monk's bell inside a church made of water. They touched down in the lee of the cell house, where shadow was less absence than shelter. And for a moment the cold was complete. It reached under clothes and took ownership of skin with the entitlement of a landlord. The fence was wire that had learned barbs as a second language. It hummed very quietly to itself, not electrified, but powerful anyway, because cuts have their own authority. They found the line where the ground rose to meet the metal, and the metal lifted just enough to accept a body thin to the floor. Crawling there made the world a smear. Pebbles wore the taste of salt, dirt brought the library of the island to the mouth, iron filings, old ash, the secret sweetness of damp. Sliding under the fence asked the back to become a page and the earth to be a press. The two impressions met and transferred information. You were here. You were nearly out. When they rose on the other side, it was into a wind more honest than the one on the roof. A wind that had fetched itself some distance, and arrived with intent, skating across the northeast shore, and hissing the quiet syllables that stones make when water has taught them to speak. There the island ended as fact, and began as decision. The bay lay ahead with a seriousness that made paper plans feel like superstition. Black water with a skin of pewter showed the low churn of currents at cross purposes. One going out, one shouldering in, both indifferent to men. The far shape of Angel Island wore its trees as a single dark mass, not detail, not invitation, only land. The raft, folded small in burden, big in consequence, was lowered to the stones with the care usually reserved for a body. It unfurled with a reluctant elasticity, the rubber remembering its shape like an animal that had slept badly and needed coaxing to stand. The device that had once been an instrument took the first breaths for it. Bellows pulling and pushing air, with an earnest rhythm, each squeeze a syllable, in a private prayer. The raft grew, not heroically, practically, to a size that could receive weight, and asked for more. They paused because pausing tests the world's attention. On the island above, nothing changed. The flood lamps continued their slow, tired revolutions. A cigarette ember made a brief red notation on the darkness near a tower, and then went out as if embarrassed by its own color. On the water, a low growl passed and faded. A ship not seen, only inferred by wake and engine rumor. In the pause, they listened for correction, for the universe clearing its throat to say no. The universe said wind and cold and distance. It did not say no. That was as much permission as men ever get. The raft was carried to the lip of the stones where waves bit in careful, repetitive tastes, learning the rubber, accepting it. They were not free up there on the roof. They were not free down here at the water. They were between ceilings. The one they had pushed aside with a soap bolt and the one the sky keeps over men who ask it for passage. The night weighed the same on both sides of the fence, but it felt different on the shore. It came with a movement that could not exist inside, the suggestion that forward could be made instead of measured. When they put hands to the raft's rim, it was not as heroes touch destiny. It was as laborers touch a load. The bay took the first inch without incident. The stones gave up the second with a scrape. The third was the threshold where footing ends and balance begins. And there at last the ceiling became sky and truth. Above, nothing ahead, cold intention. Behind, a place that would only ever be a past. The paddle blades waited with their quiet polish, and the water flexed its shoulders, as if to say, we will see what you are made of. The raft did not declare itself ready. It unfurled with the grudging elasticity of something coerced into a second life. Rubber stitched from raincoats that once kept men dry, now tasked with carrying them where no calendar could follow. On the stones of the northeast shore, the bay rehearsed its old sentence, an even patient chewing that gave nothing away, while flood lamps, far above, continued their lazy revolutions across concrete that believed it owned the night. The raft took shape under hands that shook from more than cold. Its seams glossed faintly, where heat and pressure had married desperation to craft. It looked small, it looked insufficient, it looked like truth, which is to say it did not flatter its purpose. The instrument that had once been a concertina fed it in steady, breath-like pulses, until the rubber became a body that could carry other bodies. The paddles, polished wood, backed by brass bolts stolen from the vocabulary of legitimacy, lay across knees for a last private liturgy of touch. They studied the water without seeming to, because staring teaches the bay where your faith is thin. A surface moves one way, the undercurrent moves another. Wind crosshatches both, and all of it is polite until it is not. Angel Island was a dark, low heft beyond the mouth of the cove, more silhouette than invitation. To the west, the city hummed the color of an old coin, its bridges narrow veins of sodium stitched across black. The wind scrolled down the island, and found the men by smell. Rubber, salt, fear made clean and metallic by decision. They lifted the raft. Rubber rasped stone. The sound was small, but it had edges. They lowered until the bay learned the weight, and made room. The cold did not introduce itself. It took possession. Knees lost their names first, then thighs, then the subtle strength at the hinge of the hips that keeps balance from becoming story. The water climbed with the confidence of ownership, an implacable clerk stamping received across skin. They pushed the raft off the teeth of rock, in time with a lull in the small breakers. A practiced patience that turned chance into choreography. For an instant that felt like permission, the rubber slid free of stone, and did not return. They moved, as three parts of one decision. Front, center left, center right. Knees tucked, weight distributed, elbows set to brace, without advertising panic. The raft accepted them with a pliant complaint, and then waited for orders. The first strokes were a negotiation with physics and pride. Paddles entered the water at shallow angles, blades turning with a deliberate reluctance to make noise. Slap is the language of amateurs. They spoke in pulls, long, close, efficient, each one buying inches, that felt like arguments won in a court that did not believe in mercy. The wind, even gentle, as arithmetic. It applied itself from the west, with a nudge that became a hand, pressing the raft southeast when the nose wanted north. The tide tugged obliquely, a sideways insistence that said, you are visitors. They had known this from diagrams and windows, and 1,000 unspent minutes, staring through bars. But knowledge becomes different when your ribs are counting the cost. Breath met cold in a marriage that hurt. The chest recognizes water like this as a verdict, not a suggestion. The throat tightens. The jaw locks against a chatter that would steal cadence from the arms. Fingers lose their politics with the paddle, and become citizens of ache. They worked anyway, because the only generosity the bay offers men is distance. You may have some if you buy it with exactly the right currency of effort. Counting emerged not in mouths, but in muscles. 6 left, 6 right, correct, 6 again. Hold 2 breaths. Listen, adjust. The raft's nose printed a thin V on the water that the wind tried to erase. Fog felt its cue, and began to loosen from the island's shoulder, drifting like torn cloth, hiding the rock's angles first and then its arrogance. San Francisco receded to rumor. The sound of Alcatraz. Those domestic industrial notes of authority at rest, vows gossiping, locks clearing their throats, radios clearing syllables from sleep, fell behind. Ahead, a different silence took the world. A dome of night that held only the arithmetic of swell, and the dull, periodic heartbeat of a boy. Telling no one anything useful, the moon revealed itself, and then declined the obligation to help, laying a silver ladder on the bay that pointed in the wrong direction. Beauty is a liar at sea, they ignored it. Their line was a compromise, set against the map inside the water, aimed north of Angel to be stolen south by what ran unseen. The raft shuddered, as a stronger vein of current found its flanks and took a taste. The men leaned in and answered in unison. Bodies pitched into a narrow forward fold that turned the act of paddling into a prayer said with back and shoulder. Cold slid under shirt, and along spine with surgeon's fingers, probing, patient. Time unraveled into work. Minutes blurred not into hours, but into repetition. Lift, dip, draw, feather, recover, until the motion owned them, and thought had to ask for permission to enter. Fear is loud at first, then it becomes a bass line. Above it, other considerations. Angle, drift. The thin fog that now decided to roll from left to right, rather than the other way. A sound like fabric somewhere. No, only the raft's skin taking a new wrinkle off a small wave. A distant engine. Too far to matter. Too near to forget. The question that does not go away. If the math is wrong, do you know it soon enough to fix it? Or only in the autopsy, no one will perform. One of them altered his grip, a degree to save tendon from cramping. Another unfolded a toe inside a shoe because pain, properly rationed, is fuel. None of this had a face. Faces were for daylight, for memory, for posters in offices where confidence tried on certainty and called it conclusion. Out here, only functions had names. Angel Island grew not by leaping, but by accretion, a slightly darker dark. Then a line where treetops refused the sky. Then the suggestion of slope. Their heading wavered, once under the heel of a cross-push from beneath. That felt like a hand placed flat and steady against the raft to say, not that way. The raft obeyed physics first, and men second, tilting half a degree. The correction had to be exact and modest. The bay punishes drama. They gave it 6 hard lefts in a row with the restraint of monks, the blades carving ovals that lifted no spray, and the nose turned, not quickly, but as if conceding a point in debate. For 3 breaths, the raft held the nicer angle, and then the water tested them again. Slyer this time, as though curious whether stamina had a limit that could be exploited into narrative. They passed the midline where men imagine relief should live, and discovered it had moved out. Relief was a house, with no furniture. The cold found the marrow, and sat there with its feet up. The arms began to negotiate with the will for better terms. The will smiled, and said later. The lungs looked for a rhythm that was not made of knives. A new set of waves approached from the starboard quarter, small but insistent, almost polite in their refusal to meet anyone halfway. The raft took them at an angle, because that is what one does with trouble, and kept on. The paddle's brass bolts made a mute, confidence-building weight at the join, proof that detail had not been an affectation. Somewhere behind them, in a building made of certainty, a pencil drew a straight line under a number, and believed it had understood something. Out here, understanding was done in sweat and white breath. Close is a deceit. The eye performs in partnership with hope. Close can be a mile. Close can be a lifetime. Close on the bay is what the current allows when it loses interest in you. The black beneath them shifted to the suggestion of color. Something like pewter. Something like the first lie of dawn. Even though dawn was not yet involved in this business. A smell climbed out of the dark ahead. Green and wet and old. The breath of leaves. The land's exhale. It reached them like a memory of childhood, forgotten on purpose. They did not lift their heads to meet it. Lifting wastes energy and declares victory before a finish line that has not agreed to exist. They kept their eyes at water and their hands at work, and the island obliged by becoming larger. Then the bay made its last argument. A shoulder of flow, shaped by bottom and moon in accident, slid under the raft and tried to peel it away southwest. The attempt was not violent. It was thorough. The nose yawed 1 degree, then 2, then 4. An Angel's shoreline began to drift to the right, as though someone were turning a page. This is where men lose what they have purchased. Panic buys splashes. Splashes buy attention. Attention buys mistakes. They did not panic. They bought seconds by refusing to spend them quickly. 6 strokes to port. Not hard, but exact. Synchronized into a single long muscle with 3 beats. The raft hesitated, like a mule thinking things over. Another 6. The nose stopped moving the wrong way, and resumed the conversation. The current, having tested the thesis, found it adequate, and withdrew with the indifference of a judge, whose docket is long. The last 100 yards were an intimacy no one had earned. The water softened its grammar. The wind decided it had made its point, and went to stand somewhere else. The raft nosed into a texture different from open bay, a quieter chop, reeds somewhere whispering a language not spoken by concrete. The paddles shortened their reach, trading distance for control. A breaker no higher than a hand arrived from nowhere and slapped the rubber with the rude affection of kin. Someone's teeth found someone's lip and tasted iron. No one gave the taste a name. The raft kissed sand and retreated, kissed again and stayed longer. The third kiss held. They did not leap out as men in stories do when cameras are watching. They sat still for the length of 3 breaths, because stillness tests the world for consent. The world consented. They shifted weight forward in the small heresies of men who intend to touch earth and make no noise. Feet went over. Legs followed with that particular stiffness. Cold demands. The bay clutched at ankles, as if to say that all bargains are temporary. They stood because standing is the ceremony by which water returns you to gravity. The sand gave a little and then trusted them. They did not cheer. They did not speak. The raft deflated behind them, with the sound of a long lie being told well to the end. Rubber exhaled the breath the bellows had given it, the skin wrinkling into an exhausted animal that had done what was asked. The paddles lay across the wet, their brass gone dark, as if hiding its kinship with the institution that had tried to erase this night in advance. Wind moved through leaves, in a register none of them had participated in for years. It said nothing profound. That was the mercy of it. It merely recorded their presence on land, with the indifferent hospitality trees extend to anyone not currently holding fire. Behind them, in a building that knew its own myth by heart, a plaster head waited to be found. A nose would break. A ledger would shout. Men in towers would lift beams of light and swing them, like questions over an answer already written in salt. Here, on a beach that kept no minutes, 3 figures stood at the edge of a dark that had allowed them across, not because they deserved it, but because they matched their math to its, stroke for stroke, breath for breath, until the equation reluctantly balanced. They had not won anything. They had not lost yet. The water, which keeps counsel better than any stone, closed its mouth over the wake and went on with its life. Morning on Alcatraz did not arrive with sunrise. It arrived with a change in pressure, a subtle tightening of the air as the building drew itself upright for the daily ritual of certainty. The tier lights woke in a hard white bloom, the kind that erases the idea of night rather than replaces it. A guard on the last sweep of a tired shift moved down the corridor with the bored precision of a metronome. Keys a brass whisper at his hip, boots marking out the tempo of order, radio sleeping on his belt like a domesticated animal. He passed the first cell and let the flashlight drift across the bed in a practiced crescent, catching the gray slope of a blanket, the low rise of a shoulder, the dull shine along a human nose. Familiar. He passed the second and repeated the motion, the beam sliding from pillow to cheek, to the black bar shadow that always makes a face look already caged. Familiar. He passed the third and would have kept going if the face had not offered back a reflection. It had no right to. An almost imperceptible gleam from paint, masquerading as skin. The eye does not always tell the truth to a tired brain, but fingers do. He reached through the bars and pressed 2 fingertips into the cheek to extract reassurance from flesh. There was no flesh. The cold met his fingers first, mineral, absolute, a temperature that lives in stone and laboratories, not in men. Then the wrong resistance, not muscle, not fat, not the tentative give of a jaw half asleep, but a dead smoothness, a statue's indifference. He pushed, and the head rolled without protest, found the edge of its pillow, and tipped itself into gravity. The sound it made when it hit the floor was small and ruinous, hollow, chalky, the crack of plaster at the bridge of a counterfeit nose. A piece broke away and spun once before surrendering, and the dust that rose from the impact drifted around the guard's boots like ash, searching for meaning. For a count of 1 still second, the world inside the cell held the poise of a trick about to declare itself. Then the guard's mouth found a sound that was not a word, more a swallowed oath, more a wound, and the radio on his belt came to life to meet it, crackling interrogation into the corridor. Unit 4. Status. Static, impatient. Unit 4. Confirm head count. He did not answer. The eyes he had trusted for 100 nights were busy recalibrating their faith, trying to reconcile the pillow dent that looked like sleep with the half-face on the floor that looked like treason. He clawed the blanket back, with a hand that had lost the refinement of fingers and become only a fist. Beneath, the shape that had read as a body dissolved into absence, rolled clothes, towels layered and knotted to mimic weight, an empty architecture of deception. A second voice on the radio, clipped and formal, cut across the first. Unit 4, respond. He found the word he needed and put it into the transmission, like a confession. Missing. The alarms did not begin so much as erupt. Sirens punched through the steel with a violence that shook the air. A long, institutional howl that translated into the bones of the building and woke every hinge, bolt, and heartbeat. Lights went brighter, as if more illumination could alter the facts. Doors slammed, not in pairs, but in choruses. The night's hush, always a controlled thing, engineered rather than earned, shattered into pieces that scraped across the tier and cut whoever they touched. Inmates came upright in their bunks as if hauled by wire, some with faces still fogged by sleep, some with grins they tried to tame, some with a studied blankness that had seen too much to register surprise. Laughter took root somewhere, and skittered along the metal like a quick animal. It was not mirth so much as recognition, the sound a system hears when its own myth trips on a step it built for others. Supervisors arrived with necks already rigid, voices already at volume, anger summoned as a tool for thinking. When was the last verify? Who cleared B block at 03? Who signed the count? Statements disguised as questions ricocheted down the tier. The guard who had watched the head fall pointed to the bed as if pointing could undo it, and then to the next cell, and the next, the gesture growing frantic as it discovered itself repeating. A dummy head, a false body. The bed arranged with insulting neatness. A dummy head, a false body. The same. 3 cells in a row where the ritual had been obeyed by objects, not men. The sound inside the block changed frequency. It picked up an edge like torn metal. Humiliation discovering its voice. They tore the cells apart because force is what men use when understanding refuses to arrive on time. Mattresses upended. Sheets ripped. Drawers emptied. A cup struck the floor and spun in a small, crazy circle that did not read as domestic, but as accusation. A book opened midair and fell in a hush of pages that got under the skin. Then the finding. A guard on his knees at the back wall, hand outstretched to a vent that was no longer merely a vent. The grill sat in place as if it belonged, but the plaster around it carried the faint constellation of drilled holes disguised by paint. And the screws told a story the screws had not meant to tell. He pried the cover loose with a flat bar and the wall revealed its heresy. A clean, human-sized gap leading into the building's unregulated anatomy. A flashlight's beam hesitated at the lip, and then slid into the dark like a searcher into a throat. The utility corridor swallowed the light, and returned dust. Footprints, careful, deliberate, multiple, ran through it in powder-gray arcs. A palm print on a pipe ended in a smear where sweat met grit, and made a signature. A ladder rose into the ribs of the prison, painted the same penitentiary green as the illusions it had served. Its rungs tattooed with narrow bands of cleaner metal, where hands had polished grime into a history. The first guard to climb did it too quickly, and bonged a knee with a sound that will live in his memory, as the note of betrayal. The second climbed with the dignity of someone who needed the humiliation to look like protocol. At the top, the attic space above the cell block opened like a secret church. Beams crossing beams in a geometry of support. Dust turned visible by the swing of thin light. Heat gathered under the roofline, and held the way a breath is held when a lie works. The workshop sat there as if it had always been part of the blueprints and everyone else had forgotten. A plank bench, a canvas quieting layer, the color of old sweat, scraps of rubber with edges squared by care, some stitched, some fused, some marked in pencil with simple arithmetic, paddles, with the audacity to look official, stacked with their brass bolts winking dull in the moving light. A bellows made of an instrument that once made music, its purpose altered to breath. A periscope so makeshift it offended the idea of impossibility. Thread cones filched and nearly empty. A heavy plank with darkened rectangles where weight had stood. The pressure ghosts of a vulcanizing vow. None of it shouted. All of it insisted. And one of the officers reached out and pressed fingertips into a seam on the rubber. The joint held under the test as if loyalty could be manufactured with heat and patience. He pulled his hand away quickly, as if burned by craft. What the light did to the space made it worse. It moved slowly, lamp-like, across tools and scraps and footprints, and gave everything the gravity of evidence. This was not a scramble. It was a curriculum. The island had been taught a lesson above its own head for months and had not known. The men below the roof beams looked up at the ventilator and found the final insult. A bolt that had the dignity of thread and shape but the wrong soul. Soap carved into belief, dulled with dirt until even a hand would be fooled. The cover stood ajar by a hair, the hinge holding its etiquette. Crowd psychology changed there. Horror gave way to awe, and then yanked itself back, ashamed of what it had almost admired. The commander's voice, hardened by habit, arrived at the only sentence he could allow himself. Roof, now. Outside. The floodlights continued their slow, predictable persuasion over the yard as if nothing had altered below them. The roof was a different weather, wind with salt on its teeth. Fog stretched thin as breath over tar. A scuffed path led from the ventilator to the smokestack and then to the edge. The scuff was not dramatic. Only what you would expect when rubber meets grit many nights in a row with care not to announce itself. At the edge there was no rope waiting, no narrative prop. Only the indifferent drop in the island's rock lip, wet with the memory of all water. A guard peered over, saw only the suggestion of a cove that had stopped being theory sometime in the last 6 hours, and stepped back because the body knows when a story is about to change and asks for a little more room. Lockdown moved through the island like weather. Doors sealed, gates dogged, a catalog of measures that makes sense on paper and feels performative against emptiness. Radios became rivers, demanding tributaries. Perimeter secure. Tower 1 negative. Tower 2 negative. Count again. Count the counters. The phone lines left the island and entered the city and the ocean and the country. The Bureau's switchboard saw the words Alcatraz escape and grew a second heartbeat. Coast Guard cutters that were not expecting to have opinions about history turned their bows toward the rock and wrote white lines into the black water. Helicopters learned the island's silhouette from above and discovered it was both more and less than the legend said. Search patterns spread outward in careful geometry that looked like hope from a distance and like bureaucracy from inside the pattern. Back in the block, one of the guards, older eyes, with the dregs of 1,000 midnights in them, stood over the half-shattered head on the floor and felt the particular terror reserved for professionals. The knowledge that he had done what he was told to do exactly as he was told to do it, and it had failed him. The nose lay in 2 pieces, like punctuation marks. The mouth, painted with a restraint that now felt like mockery, stared its powdery stare. He wanted to kick it, and did not, because anger would not return the past to its correct position. He bagged it instead, because evidence cures some humiliations by turning them into process. Interviews began with families who had no answers, and reputations who had no shame, and men who had nothing to gain from speaking, but spoke anyway, because stories must go somewhere. The island coughed up small facts that would matter later. For now, morning was about admitting that night had done work under its nose. Guards moved through spaces they had believed they knew and found angles that had learned to hide from them. The prison doctor lit a cigarette and let it drown to a wet stump between 2 fingers before he remembered why he had come into the block. The warden, who had practiced speeches about strength, composed one about investigation and integrity and partnership, and said none of the sentences he wanted to say. The sentences that blamed physics for not being more loyal, and men for being precisely themselves. The laughter that had broken out among the inmates earlier did not vanish. It changed key, softened into something almost reverent in places, the way men respond to a magic trick that overperforms its promise. It was not approval. It was relief that the world retained the capacity to surprise even here, especially here. A few faces closed down like shutters because survival prefers a small aperture. Others watched with the wide eyes of those who have just seen a law bend. Across the water, the city went on drop by drop with what cities do, and the bay wore its same weary, glitterless expression. The island, which had always imagined itself as a fact, found out it could be a question. By mid-morning, Alcatraz had revised itself from fortress to crime scene. Yellow tape would have looked foolish here. Instead, there were men whose presence is a kind of line. Evidence bags bloomed like gray flowers. Cameras, those square, hungry official cameras, took pictures that made sense to files first, and to memory later. Someone wrote the words, "decoy head" on a tag, and had to pause, because writing the truth sometimes makes it too real. Someone else, on the roof, knelt by the hinge of the ventilator, and ran a thumbnail under tar to feel the age of it, as if the island's skin might confess timing. And somewhere offshore, beyond the reach of the island's noise, the water lay back down, over the channels that had been disturbed, and smoothed them, as if to say the past is a surface function. Morning found the lie, and the lie had already performed its whole purpose and exited. What remained was the echo. Boots where boots had missed, voices where voices had failed. A building that had believed in inevitability, discovering the grace and terror of contingency. Men in uniform stood a little straighter under the weight of that revelation, then bent to the practical work, because that is what men do when legends misbehave. They inventory the impossible, and they start deciding what they can afford to admit. The bay did not confess in words. It confessed in fragments. At first light, the water looked harmless, smooth, slate-colored, almost serene. But every man who had ever worked the coastline knew that stillness on the surface meant nothing about what boiled beneath. The first Coast Guard cutter cut across the morning like a razor, its wake a white wound across gray water, as crew members scanned the surface for the solemn trophies of failure. Bodies, boards, scraps of fabric. They expected tragedy to float, because the bay never truly buried its dead. But the water remained indifferent. No debris, no movement, just the slow pulse of the tide. The search expanded. More boats, more eyes, binoculars raised against fog that rolled in off the Pacific, like a great patient animal. Helicopter blades churned the air, flattening the water in temporary submission. The island behind them stood silent, its stone shoulders hunched against humiliation, as if trying to pretend it hadn't been breached. But the bay remembered. It always remembers. And slowly, it began to speak. Inside Alcatraz, the investigation laid itself out in objects, rather than answers. The escape was no longer a mystery of men. It was a mystery of craft. On the warden's desk, the tools of defiance sat arranged like museum pieces. A vacuum motor with wires stripped and reattached by someone who understood electricity, without schooling. Sharpened spoons worn thin from carving plaster. Smooth strips of raincoat rubber, fused together with the perfect unity of heat and pressure. A mirror shard sharpened to a scalpel. Each item was tagged, labeled, photographed. FBI agents in dark suits moved around the table with clinical fascination, lifting objects with gloved hands, as though examining relics. The warden watched with arms crossed tightly over his chest, his pride a brittle thing under the eyes of outsiders. The bureau men didn't say it out loud, but their silence said everything. This was not desperation. This was engineering. The raft's absence screamed louder than any siren. No trace of it remained in the workshop, except for a few cuttings on the floor, each trimmed with surgical precision. The rubber was heat-fused, the seams airtight, the workmanship too clean for amateurs. One agent ran his finger along a fused seam and shook his head, quiet awe hiding behind his professional restraint. They knew exactly what they were doing. The warden hated that sentence more than anything. If prisoners could build this much freedom in silence, what else had the prison failed to see? The idea landed like a crack in the foundation. Maybe the walls weren't unbreakable. Maybe the guards weren't all-seeing. Maybe the rock was only as strong as the illusions it projected. Officials clung desperately to the story that made the world safer. They must have drowned. No one can beat the bay. The water is too cold. The current too strong. The distance too great. This narrative was clean, comforting, familiar, but the evidence refused to stay obedient. On the second day, a paddle surfaced near Angel Island. Rough-cut wood, hand-shaped, reinforced with brass bolts. The same brass bolts used throughout the prison. The officers pulled it aboard and laid it on the deck with reverence. Because this was not debris. This was proof. Proof they had made it off the island. Proof they had paddled into the current. Proof that at least part of the plan worked flawlessly. The warden stared at that paddle, like it had insulted him personally. It was too well made, too deliberate, too confident. It looked official, sanctioned, a weapon made from the prison's own bones. Soon after, letters surfaced, found floating inside a piece of raincoat rubber, sealed and dry, addressed to family members, calm, controlled. No panic, no apologies, no goodbyes. They read more like instructions than farewells. They suggested a plan that extended beyond the water. The FBI kept their contents private, but their faces betrayed enough. These men didn't escape into chaos. They escaped into structure. On the third day, the bay gave up something more haunting. A homemade life vest, washed ashore on Cronkite Beach, bloated and torn, but unmistakable. The same raincoat material, the same stitching pattern, the same heat-sealed seams. Reporters seized on it instantly. This was it. The smoking gun. Evidence escapees drowned. The newspapers screamed. The public relaxed. The legend of Alcatraz remained intact. But the men searching the water were not satisfied. A torn life vest did not prove death. It proved danger. It proved struggle. It proved reality. It did not prove failure. Bodies proved failure. And the bay, cruel as it was, rarely kept all bodies to itself. Yet days passed. Weeks. Nothing surfaced. Not a shoe, not a finger bone, not even a scrap of clothing, unmistakably from a corpse. For a body to vanish entirely, the timing, temperature, current, and decay rate would all have to align perfectly. And nature rarely negotiates with precision. The absence of bodies became its own kind of evidence. Meanwhile, the FBI built profiles, like coroners build autopsies. They dug through records, from Leavenworth, Atlanta, Florida State. Every institution that had tried and failed to contain Frank Morris, or the Anglin brothers. Frank, solitary thinker, high IQ, twice as patient as his guards. John and Clarence, strong swimmers since childhood, practiced in silence, fiercely loyal to each other, able to endure discomfort longer than most men could endure breath. In every report, every transfer, every disciplinary note, the same pattern emerged. They didn't just survive prison, they studied it. And then the most chilling sentence, in one agent's report: these men were conditioned for this. Not impulsive, not reckless. Conditioned. They interrogated everyone. Cellmates, kitchen workers, laundry crews, guards from previous prisons, family members with nothing but pennies to their name. They turned over houses in Florida and barns in Georgia. They shadowed relatives for weeks. They tore apart fishing cabins. They followed rumors like bloodhounds. A sighting in Chicago, a whisper in Texas, a rumor in Brazil. Testimonies conflicted. Nothing was verifiable. But the sheer volume of reports said something louder than truth. The world wanted them to be alive. Not because people admired criminals, but because people admired the idea that walls are not absolute. The investigation room in the bureau office became a cathedral of obsession. Maps of the bay covered entire walls, marked in different colors, predicted wind drift, tidal flow, launch angle, paddle velocity, average raft speed, time of departure. They calculated scenarios down to the minute. If they launched at 11:30 p.m. and paddled at an angle 15 degrees north of Angel Island, they would reach land by 12:50 am. If they rested halfway, they'd reach by 1:20 am. If the current carried them further north, they could reach Tiburon. If south, Sausalito. If luck was with them, San Rafael. Beyond that, freedom. The mathematics were brutal, but they were also hauntingly plausible. And then there was the soap bolt. The object that broke the room. A perfect replica of a metal bolt, carved from soap, threaded, shaped, painted, dirtied, convincing. It held the ventilator in place for days, maybe weeks. When agents tested it, it screwed in perfectly. Foolproof, elegant, genius. Without that bolt, everything falls apart. With it, no one even looked up. The warden stared at that bolt longer than he looked at any evidence. It was the symbol of everything he could not accept. It was the moment the prison lost, because a man can overpower guards, with violence, but to outthink them, to make them complicit in the lie. That is dominance. That is artistry. That is unforgivable. The escape was no longer a crime. It was a statement. And then the question changed. It wasn't, did they drown? Anymore. It was, what if they didn't? That question infected the island like smoke. Because if 3 men could slip through the most secure prison in America, if they could ride the deadliest water in the country, if they could disappear without leaving a body behind, what else was possible? The Bay had not returned them. The prison could not stop them. The evidence refused to close the case. And in that silence, cold, vast, unending, someone whispered the only truth that mattered. Maybe the greatest proof of escape is the fact that nobody can prove what happened. The island tried to return to order, but order no longer trusted the island. The sirens had fallen quiet. The prisoners had been forced back into their cells. The guards had resumed their patrols. And yet Alcatraz felt different, like a stage after the actors have left, but the lights are still burning. The prison had always operated with a kind of arrogant rhythm. Count, lock, report, repeat. A structure so rigid, it seemed incorruptible. But now there was a pause in everything, a hesitation in every step. The men in uniform no longer walked the tiers with the confidence of wardens. They moved like witnesses. The bars that once felt like the teeth of a predator now felt like ribs of a carcass. Something sacred had been violated. Not the law, not the routine, but the illusion that those walls understood the men inside them. The warden stood in his office with the windows open, letting in the sound of the bay. A sound he once found steadying, but now felt mocking. The waves did not care about his protocols. The wind did not respect his authority. The ocean had swallowed 3 men right out from under him, either into death or into freedom. And he wasn't sure which possibility was worse, because death would prove the prison right. Freedom would prove the prison worthless. He pored over the incident reports, until the ink blurred, and the words clung to each other like wet leaves. He read every guard's testimony, every log entry, every scribbled note, searching for some moment, some second, when the prison could have stopped this from happening. But there was nothing. No warning sign, no suspicious noise, no broken schedule. The system had worked exactly as designed, and the escape had happened anyway. That was the most terrifying part. This wasn't the result of negligence. This was the result of perfection. Perfection exploited by patience. By the second day, the FBI had turned one of the administrative rooms into a war room. Tables covered in maps blocked the windows. A massive chart of San Francisco Bay stretched across an entire wall, marked with streaks of colored chalk, tracing tidal flows and predictive drift paths, like capillaries across skin. There were smaller maps too. Angel Island, Marin County shoreline, Tiburon Peninsula, Sausalito, the Golden Gate, even farther north, Sonoma Coast, Bodega Bay. The investigation no longer belonged to the island. It belonged to the water, and the water obeyed no one's jurisdiction. Agents paced the room like undertakers, sharp suits rumpled by sleeplessness, collars loosened, eyes hardened by the dawning fear that this was not just an escape, it was a blueprint. Everything was documented, every tool, every piece of evidence, every witness. They interviewed the guards until their voices broke. They interviewed prisoners who claimed ignorance, but whose eyes gleamed with a strange, dangerous respect. They interviewed cooks, janitors, maintenance men. Someone somewhere had to have seen something. Someone had to have heard something. But even when they found men who suspected something, who had heard odd scraping sounds in the night, or noticed small shifts in routines, or seen blankets that looked too carefully arranged, none of them spoke until after the fact. Fear had kept them docile. Fear, or awe. When the FBI asked, "Why didn't you say anything?" One prisoner simply smiled. Because I wanted to see if they'd make it. That answer echoed through the room like blasphemy. Theories formed like storm clouds. The first and simplest. They drowned. It was what the public wanted to believe. What the prison wanted to believe. What the government needed to believe. The bay was cold. Hypothermia sets in within minutes. The currents were vicious, colliding and fracturing, like glass beneath the surface. The wind that night had been mild, but the tide had been leaving the bay, dragging everything outward with tremendous force. And yet, why no bodies? Why no scraps of raft? Why paddles? Why letters in waterproof wrap? Why a seam in the life vest that looked torn instead of rotted? Why plan this escape so meticulously, only to die in the water, like amateurs? The second theory? They made it to Angel Island, but died there, hiding, freezing, starving, broken bones climbing the steep rocky edges of the shoreline. Some agents believed this. It was clean, logical. It preserved the legend of Alcatraz, while allowing the men a brief moment of success. But search teams combed Angel Island, from beach to peak. Dogs sniffed old bunkers, ravines, abandoned structures. No blood, no clothing, no footprints, nothing. The third theory surfaced only in whispers. Someone helped them. A boat waiting offshore. A collaborator inside the prison. A contact on the mainland. But who? The inmates had no money. Their families were poor and heavily surveilled. No guard had gone missing. No boat had reported unusual activity. No fishermen reported strange lights. Still, the idea lingered in the air like fog. Someone helped them, or someone was helped by them. The warden refused it. The FBI didn't. They had seen impossible collaborations before. Money is one way to buy help. Fear is another. The fourth theory was the one that kept the room awake long after midnight. They were smarter than we are. It was less a theory and more an admission. The men in charge didn't want to speak it, but the younger agents did. One of them, not yet 30, stood in front of the tidal chart and traced a finger along the colored currents. They didn't fight the water, he said. They used it. He pointed at the angle of launch. Look, they didn't paddle straight for Angel. That would be suicide. They launched at a diagonal, aiming for where the current would carry them. An older agent scoffed. Luck. The younger one shook his head. Look at the timing. They left near slack tide, when the water is changing direction. That's the hardest time to predict. Hardest for us, easiest for them. He wasn't wrong. The bay had rules, but rules known only to those who lived in it. Prisoners had been studying the water for years, through windows, during work shifts, from the yard. They had memorized the patterns of the wind, the taste of the currents, the arrival of fog. They had no instruments. They had something better, obsession. The obsession seeped into the investigation, like seawater through a crack in a hull. Agents stopped speaking in hours, and started speaking in tides. They built models out of string and pins, where a raft might drift, if paddled, if abandoned, if overturned. They consulted with oceanographers, fishermen, Navy hydrologists. They studied the moon phase from that night, waning crescent, low illumination, weaker gravitational pull. They logged the wind speed every 15 minutes. They charted barometric pressure. They reconstructed the night as if reconstructing a crime scene. But the scene wasn't a room, or a street, or a bank. It was the Pacific Ocean. And the Pacific Ocean does not stand still for memories. One agent requested access to historical weather data, only to find that the Coast Guard had incomplete records from that night, due to fog interference in their logging. That missing information became a vortex of rumor. Was the weather truly mild as the official statement claimed? Or had someone altered the report to preserve the illusion of inevitability? If the wind was just a little softer, the currents a little weaker, the temperature a little higher, survival became plausible. And the longer the investigation continued, the more plausible survival seemed. They ran numbers. They tested similar rafts. They staged experiments. One night, under similar tidal conditions, the Coast Guard launched a dummy raft near Alcatraz. It drifted, without paddling, almost exactly along the angle predicted by the prisoner's escape plan. It reached Angel Island. It didn't capsize. It didn't tear. It didn't sink. It landed on the shore like a quiet promise. That result was never released to the public. Inside the prison, time twisted itself into knots. Prisoners whispered new legends in the dark. Some swore they'd heard the men laughing as they climbed through the vents, that they'd heard the raft launch, that they heard the bay accept them like a gate opening. Others claimed they saw lights on the water, a boat drifting quietly offshore. And still others, those who had known Frank Morris, said nothing at all, just smiled with a kind of reverence, because Frank didn't believe in failure. His mind did not bend that direction. If he built something, if he mapped something, if he committed to something, then it worked. There was no other outcome. The FBI pulled every scrap of personal history on Frank and the Anglins. They interviewed childhood acquaintances, who remembered the Anglin brothers, swimming across frozen lakes in Michigan, just for fun. They found arrest records showing Frank had rebuilt radios in solitary confinement, just to hear music. They read psychologist reports, labeling him dangerously intelligent. They underlined that phrase more than once. Someone in the room said, "These men were built in laboratories of misery, and they learned to turn misery into something useful." The warden hated that sentence most of all. Theories multiplied like mold on damp concrete. Some were rational, some were far-fetched, some bordered on madness. One suggested Morris had contact with a crime syndicate on the outside. Another claimed the Anglins had family with a fishing boat on the coast who helped them disappear. Someone proposed that they made it across the bay, stole clothes, hijacked a car, and drove south, vanishing into Mexico. Another insisted they made their way north, maybe into Washington, or even into Canada. A few agents considered the possibility that they split up after making land, but no theory could be proven. Every possible path was missing a piece. Every map ended in fog. The warden wanted finality. The Bureau wanted accuracy. The government wanted silence. Newspapers wanted blood. Public fascination exploded. Escape from the Rock. One headline screamed. Did they survive? Asked another. Interviews were conducted with locals who thought they saw 3 wet men walking barefoot along the road near Marine. Patrons at a bar claimed 2 strangers came in after midnight, soaked, shivering, buying cheap whiskey, and leaving before finishing. A farmer reported missing clothes from his line. Dogs barked at nothing in the woods. Flashlights swept through brush. Deputies followed footprints that vanished in the rocks. The world was suddenly full of ghosts. And then the letters started. Not from the escapees, but from people who had seen them, people who had spoken to them, people who were them. Dozens of letters, hundreds. I saw them in Oregon. They came through Tulsa. One of them works in a factory in Ohio. I met Frank Morris in El Paso. My cousin knows a man in South America who looks exactly like John Anglin. Some letters were scams, some were jokes, some were jokes, some were desperate bids for attention. But a few were too detailed, too specific, too believable. The FBI chased them all. For years, theories became currency inside the Bureau. Some agents believed wholeheartedly that the men drowned in the bay. Others believed just as strongly that they made it. Arguments broke out. Ties loosened. Files piled up. A few careers were quietly built on this case. A few were quietly destroyed. No one wanted to be the one to admit ignorance. But pressure grows like mold in sealed rooms. By the late 1960s, the FBI was no longer just investigating the escape. They were defending their reputation. Politicians wanted a conclusion. End it, they said. File it. Seal it. Tell the public what we already know. Nobody beats Alcatraz. The Bureau resisted. They said more time was needed. They chased another tip. A man in Florida claimed 2 strangers visited his mother every Christmas. A bank teller swore she saw a familiar face. A barber in Georgia said he never forgot a jawline. More time. More files. More maps. More frustration. The case refused to die. It lived in filing cabinets, in restless dreams, in the way the warden paused whenever he heard the ocean, in the way younger guards stared out across the water at night, imagining 3 silhouettes paddling under moonlight. It lived in the small doubt that creeps into certainty, like a draft through an old window. And then one day, the prison died first. In 1963, Alcatraz was shut down. Official reason? Too expensive. Real reason? Too humiliated. The Rock was no longer the pinnacle of security. It was an open question, a wound, an exposed nerve. Shutting it down didn't erase the shame, but it stopped the bleeding. Agents held onto the case even after the prison closed. They kept chasing leads. They kept debating. They kept building theories. They kept watching the water. And then in the 1970s, something unexpected happened. The younger agents grew older, and the older agents retired. New blood arrived. They didn't remember the night of the escape. They didn't feel the humiliation in their bones. They didn't see the bolt carved from soap as a personal insult. To them, the case wasn't a wound. It was history, and history is easier to file. By 1978, the case had become a weight. There were bigger threats now. Organized crime, foreign espionage, terrorism. The world was changing, and 3 ghosts in the bay felt less urgent every year. Still, no one wanted to be the one to sign the paper, to declare the mystery dead, to close the door on a story that never truly ended. One agent, a veteran of the original search team, stood in the FBI office late one night, staring at the evidence board under fluorescent light. Paddles, charts, photos, mugshots. The map of the bay still stretched across the wall, its faded chalk lines crisscrossing like veins. He ran his hand over it slowly, tracing the line from Alcatraz to Angel Island. The line he had traced 1,000 times. He stood there for a long moment, silent. Then he said the quiet part out loud. They made it. No one argued. No one agreed. Some truths live beyond evidence. In December of 1979, the FBI officially closed the case. The files were boxed. The evidence was stored. The internal conclusion: vague and unsatisfying, was that the men most likely drowned in the bay. That phrase, most likely, was the lifeboat they clung to. Not definitive, not final, just enough to placate the public, to satisfy the politicians, to preserve the legend of Alcatraz. But every man who had ever stood on that rooftop, or stared at the bay in the dark, or traced the current lines on the map, or held the soap bolt in his hand, knew something else. Cases can be closed on paper, questions cannot, and nothing in this world is more dangerous, more enduring, or more alive than a question left unanswered. The bay remembers in silence. Long after the alarms died, long after the prison closed, long after the case was stamped and filed in a cabinet, no one opened any more. The water kept moving with the same steady pull. It had the night 3 men disappeared into its black lungs. The island remained, gray, skeletal, half museum and half mausoleum. Its corridors walked now, not by guards or prisoners, but by tourists, eager to taste the mythology. They pressed their hands to the bars. They peered into the cells. They whispered about the escape like children telling ghost stories in the dark. Some stood in front of the dummy heads in the display case and laughed at how crude they looked. But if you stood there long enough, if you stared into the plaster eyes and imagined the room in darkness, you understood the truth. You didn't need perfection to fool a system. You only needed the system to believe in itself more than it believed in possibility. The tour guides told the approved version. They probably drowned. The water was too cold. The tides were unforgiving. But then inevitably, they would lower their voice just slightly, almost as if the walls still had ears, and say, "But no bodies were ever found." And the group would go quiet, because that space between certainty and silence is where the human mind begins to dream. The cells still smelled of rust and damp memory. The paint still curled on the walls like tired skin. The vents behind the beds remained patched. But if you pressed your fingertips to them, you could almost feel the echo of hands that once carved holes in the night. Up in the attic above the cell block, the workshop had been cleaned, sterilized, stripped of everything that gave it life. But the dust was different there. It clung in a way that suggested something had happened, that the building could never quite scrub out. The beams overhead creaked with the memory of men crawling through darkness, carrying tools made from faith. A place can forget names, but it never forgets movement. The rooftop still breathed wind. The smokestack still stood at the edge of sky. And when fog rolled through, just right, it felt like the night was returning piece by piece, reconstructing itself from vapor. If you stood there in that fog and closed your eyes, you could hear the faint scrape of rubber across stone. You could hear the soft thud of a rope against a wall. You could hear the bay, always the bay, whispering its ancient hymn, take or deliver, sometimes both. The FBI files gathered dust in storage, but agents, new agents, curious agents, still pulled them out every few years. Not officially, not for work, just to read, just to wonder. The older agents, the ones who had been there, never truly let it go. Some retired with the case, still living like a splinter under their skin. Some died, still asking the question. Sometimes, even decades later, a postcard would arrive at a police station in Florida, or Michigan, or California. No return address, just a few words, sometimes just a name, sometimes just a location, sometimes a photograph of 3 men sitting on a beach, backs to the camera. No one could prove anything. No one could disprove anything. The case was closed, but the story refused to stay buried. In 2013, the U.S. Marshals received a letter from someone claiming to be one of the escapees. He wrote, "Yes, we all made it that night." He said one had died. He said he was sick. He asked for help. He offered to come in, if they promised not to send him back to prison. They tested the letter. They analyzed the handwriting. They debated. They never released the conclusion. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it didn't matter. Because the truth was never the point. The mystery was. The question has kept the story alive longer than any answer could. People come to Alcatraz now for the view, the history, the thrill. But what keeps them there, what makes them stand in those cells longer than they need to, is not the brutality of the prison. It's the breach in the myth. The knowledge that even in the most controlled environment ever built, someone found a way to imagine something different, to test the edges of the impossible, to try. Freedom isn't always a destination. Sometimes it's a moment, a single breath of open air on a rooftop, after years of fluorescent ceilings, the sound of water accepting a raft, the first glimpse of land not written in schedules or counts, whether they lived or died. They reached that moment. That moment is what haunts the island. The bay keeps its own counsel. Some nights it lies flat as glass, as if nothing dangerous ever happened on its surface. Other nights, storms tear across it, slamming waves against the rock in fits of memory. On those nights, the water sounds like footsteps, like paddles, like men speaking quietly in the dark. Time has turned the escape into legend, but legends have power. because they are unfinished. The ocean never returned the bodies. The men were never found. No one can say with certainty what happened next, and uncertainty is the one thing Alcatraz was built to destroy. The fact that it couldn't, that it still can't, is why the legend endures. The island remains, the cells remain, the winds remain, the bay remains. Still watching, still carrying, still silent. Somewhere, in that silence, 3 men are either gone, or free. And the water, patient, ancient, undefeated, will never tell the difference.